what is a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO? A CAFO is essentially, we've taken animals off the land. They are now confined in buildings above a manure pit. And so it's concentrated because we're concentrating the number, of course, and of these animals. The other thing that's happened here, though, as a result of concentrating animals in this way, we've also concentrated the market. So, but generally concentrated has to do with how these animals are raised. How is a CAFO different from a local livestock farm? Essentially with a CAFO, these are usually contract growers. We have changed, we've had this tremendous transformation in rural America over the past 20 to 30 years, where we have transformed rural America from independent farmers to a sea of contract growers. And there's like this long fishing line that's extended from the multinationals at the top that goes down to the contract growers at the bottom. And we all know the statement from Earl Butz, get big or get out. And so I'm going to tell you a little story here that'll help drive this home. My sister and brother-in-law farmed just outside our hometown of Blooming Prairie. And Dave had hogs. And so Dave and Shelley were independent hog farmers. That meant that they owned their own hogs. And in the 90s, Dave noticed that it was taking longer at the point of delivery, which would be Hormel in Austin, because we were starting to see the introduction of these CAFOs that were going in. And so these large semi-loads of hogs were getting preferential treatment, and they were getting ushered through the Hormel plant immediately. And the independents like Dave and others, these guys had to sit on the sidelines. And so they would wait 45 minutes to an hour for their hogs to get them into the plant. Well, in the meantime, you know, the hogs are dropping weight. You get paid based on the weight of the hogs. And eventually, they were kind of forced out of the field completely, you know, forced out of the industry completely, because the only way you were going to stay in was you had to sign a contract. And so that meant giving up ownership of your hogs. You would no longer own your own hogs. And the only way you could stay in the system is you signed a contract with one of these integrators and agreed to build a great big CAFO on your farm. So they basically lost access to the marketplace. And this has all been very contrived, very intentional, and they forced all these independents out first, and then they signed up these guys as contract growers.
What would be your opening advice to a county or township confronted for the first time by a proposed large corporate CAFO or a large livestock operation? And what I've found, we've been working on this issue for about 4 years, is that people tend to really dive into the environmental impacts, impact to water, air, and that's all really important. But as a decision maker, I think it's important for people, the decision makers, to understand the political landscape that they're working in. And this industry is really working at two levels. The global level, this is a global market that is trying to come into your community. And so you'll be looking at real big global issues. And then you'll also be looking at very local issues and how those global issues play locally. And one of the things that you'll find in particular is that there's a complex web that is supporting this global marketplace that's trying to come into your community. And that's going to include giant corporations that people have heard about, like Cargill and Tyson, or maybe the Chinese-owned Smithfield Foods or the Brazilian-owned JBS. But there's also going to be a whole complex web of regional and local people who are going to want to be part of this economy. And you really are, I would advise that you get to an idea of who they are. Here in Wisconsin, it's really the people who want to build the factories that are paying for a lot of the political work that's going on. So all the way from the folks who come in and move the dirt to build the buildings, the electricians, HVAC. You've got the people who are doing the metal fabricating for the sow crates or for the giant dairy carousels that they'll grow, that they'll build as part of the factory. So you'll really find that it's not really just Smithfield or Cargill that you're dealing with, but you're dealing with a really big economic force. Then at the local level, we've found that you can't really predict who's going to be interested in having these large factories and who isn't. It could be a Republican who doesn't want to send food to the Communist Party of China. It could be, you could have some Democrats who think global markets are great and want to have a global competitor in their area. It could be some family feud where for the last 50 or 100 years, two families have been arguing about something, and this is a new thing that they're focused on. So I really recommend that you get a feel for that local, what's going on locally as well as globally.
What are 3 key points that a county or township should consider in the development of a feedlot ordinance? Number 1, animal unit cap. And in Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture developed, it's called the Animal Ordinance Map. Look for it on the MDA website. And it's actually developed for the industry. It's not developed for the neighbors or regular folks like us. And basically that animal ordinance map provides a quick way to go in and look at your county and see, for example, is there an animal unit cap? Do any of the townships have local planning and zoning? So I would suggest, number 1, study that map. And you'll find that some of the counties in the state have an animal unit cap. Dodge County, for example, is 3,000 animal units. Well, 3,000 animal units, if it's hogs, that's that means you could have a facility as large as 9,000 to 10,000 hogs. So the animal unit is pegged to like 1 adult steer. So think of it that way. So 3.33 hogs equal 1 steer. So with 3,000 animal units, and if it's hogs, you can see that in Dodge County, you could have a facility as large as almost 10,000 hogs. Now, Winona County, for example, has been successful because they reduced the animal unit cap to 1,500 animal units. And they're dealing with Daily Farms in Winona County that wants a variance. They want to go over the 1,500 animal unit cap. So that's number 1, study that map. Number 2, in Minnesota, a township can draft township ordinances that are more restrictive than the county. So for example, as I mentioned, Dodge County has 3,000 animal unit cap. At the township level, you can reduce that cap even further to say 1,500 animal units or 1,000 animal units and reduce the size of the operations. So that's a critical thing for counties and townships to do. You'd be surprised at the number of counties and townships in Minnesota that do not have an animal unit cap, that do not have their own local planning and zoning, and that's critical. A third point I would raise is local planning and zoning. You can require, for example, a minimum number of acres that they have associated with these facilities, and say a minimum of 150 acres or 250 or 240 or 360 or whatever. Because what happens, they put these facilities on, they'll carve out a little tiny postage stamp size parcel of land, 4 to 6 acres. They put the facility on there, and where are you going to spread the manure? So again, no one knows where the manure is being spread, but guaranteed it's not going to be spread on 4 or 6 acres of land. But so there are some things that can be done at the local level. We have a Dodge County Concerned Citizens has a website, dodgecc.org. We've included some of the local ordinances that were drafted, for example, in Ripley Township, some of the other townships. I mean, they're kind of baseline, but at least it's something that's in place to try and prohibit some of this industrial ag.
Jeff Forster, Minnesota Lakes and Rivers advocates, and we've been concerned about CAFOs for some time. It used to be Minnesota was, I think, probably 15 years ago, we were like number 8 in the country in terms of hog production. We're now number 2. The industry is moving to the state, and it will impact water quality, and that's our primary concern. And I think that there's a two-pronged attack, really. The first is the local engagement, people working in their township level, county level, to, make sure that the permits are being followed and the plans are being implemented, and that, the permitting process is, followed and rigorous and all of that. But then we also need to change the scaffold around these operations at the state level. So things like the liability insurance that these CAFOs must have, the requirements of the permits, the amount of water that they can use, the fines for overdrawing your permits, all of those need to be stepped up. Or if we don't do that, in a very short time, Minnesota's water quality will resemble that of Iowa. And, we can't accept that. Their water is notoriously polluted in Iowa. I think they're at like 68% of the surface waters in the state are impaired. So that's why I think efforts like this at the county level and township level, paired with the state level, are so productive and so necessary at this time. The other piece is we've been promoting Up the Creek Meats, which is kind of the solution. If the CAFO is the large industrialized logging, if the CAFO is the large industrial farming, you can also find providers in your area that will produce meat, pork, beef, that use regenerative agriculture and look at soil health and actually protect and improve water quality through their farming operation. It's a different style of farming. It's a older style of farming, but it is labor intensive, not mechanized. So it's better for smaller communities because people are employed on the farms. They are away from the automation of farming. And one of the things that one of the Up the Creek Meats farmers said to me that I thought was really profound is he said, the way I work and the work that I do is a prayer. He's a very spiritual, religious person, and he sees it as creating life and sustaining life in that area. The other thing that he said to me that I thought was very, very profound is there's nothing on this farm that's dangerous. He doesn't have to worry about his kids coming across chemicals or machinery or these sewer pits. The other thing is, we talk about sewer application, but when you're looking at a farm that's got, a population of hogs that's 5 times the size of the nearby town, well, the nearby town has a sewage treatment plant. The farm doesn't. It has a pit, it pumps it up, it spreads it on the land. Would you tolerate your community not having a sewage treatment facility and just spreading it on the yards around the neighborhoods? This isn't the family farm as we think of it. And I don't think it's the right fit for a place like Minnesota where there's so much water. So in Minnesota, currently in 2018-19, after these CAFOs began to come in, we had 40% of the surface waters in Minnesota were impaired. And the primary impairment is phosphorus, and that's sewage, and soil erosion and so forth. I think it was 3 years ago, right before the pandemic, 2020, we were at 56% impaired. And since then, there's been more CAFOs, more agricultural, these large animal feedlots. And what I find so fascinating about this is it's not really farming, right? What they need for a CAFO is a road so they can bring the feed in, and they need clean water. Hogs don't tolerate polluted water well. So they need clean water and they need roads, so they could put them anywhere, and they're putting them in Minnesota because we have clean water, and there's talk of disease in the hog industry in Iowa, and that's largely because of the water. So they're coming for the clean water, but it won't last long. And CAFOs are a migratory industry. They're moving. CAFOs in Ohio, right, were the source of the pollution that caused the blue-green algae bloom in Lake Erie that shut down the water system in Toledo, Ohio for 2.5 weeks. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their water. They couldn't drink it. They couldn't bathe in it. They couldn't use it. It was toxic. So, when the water becomes so impaired that the CAFO is no longer feasible, they move and leave the pollution behind.
I'm Jeff Broberg. I'm a licensed professional geologist. I live on a farm in Elba Township in Dakota land in western Winona County. And I've got a lot of experience in environmental risk management, a 30-year career as a professional geologist and risk manager, and I've devoted my retirement life to helping people assure that we have safe drinking water with participation in a group called the Minnesota Well Owners Organization. So today you've asked me a number of kind of specific questions, and the first was, has livestock manure spreading been associated with water pollution or fish kills in southeast Minnesota or elsewhere that you know of? And the answer is a definitive yes. We have in western Winona County, unfortunate, we've had a series of fish kills, 4 fish kills in the last 6 years, all within 10 miles of the little town of Lewiston, Minnesota. And all of them were in the middle of the summer when dairy farmers were spreading manure on freshly cut hay fields. They were also spraying exceedingly toxic fungicides on the fields next door, and we end up having a heavy rain that causes a runoff event. And it flushes the manure, depleting the oxygen, making the water turbid, and adding the chemicals that become toxic to the fish. The first fish kill, I got the call about the same time the DNR did, and I lived only 3 miles away. And as I drove there, I could see where a farmer had cut the hay out of their drainage way and spread the manure in the drainage way. There's no way that would be permitted under the best management practices, and yet it occurs nonetheless. So we have this issue that lack of appropriate manure storage for these large facilities is forcing people into a system of year-round manure application. And inevitably, they're trying to beat the weather. So if you're familiar with hay production, that's sensitive as it is. You want to get the hay in before it rains, get it put up so that it's dry and maintains its nutrition. But then they recommend that you spread your manure within 4 days of cutting the hay. That means you're typically having to find a 5 or 7 day window when you're not going to have a raining runoff event. It's lacking the protections that are necessary for preserving our water quality. It's particularly a problem here in southeastern Minnesota with the karst because our surface water is the groundwater. On my farm, the water does not leave my farm on the surface. It runs down the hill into a rocky valley and it disappears into the rocks. That means that everybody that's spreading manure in my area that has runoff that goes into these same drainage ways is shortcutting and taking away any protection and directly, essentially, injecting manure into the bedrocks. So we have many instances. We've seen this in other parts of the country. Doer County, Wisconsin, an area that is also karst, has a lot of dairy. They have a problem with pathogens in the water, with viruses and bacteria and disease-causing organisms that are in the manure that go down the cracks in the rock and feed the groundwater. So this is a problem almost everywhere that we have this issue of timing, of not being able to put manure on the landscape at the right time. The second question is, what are the known threats to private well water quality and quantity from CAFOs? Let's talk about the quantity first. CAFOs, under the Minnesota definition, are typically those farms with an animal units of 1,000 or more animal units, equivalent to 1,000 pounds per animal unit. So one animal unit is approximately equivalent to 4 people. So if you have a CAFO of 10,000 cows, that's equivalent to a town of 40,000 people in their water use. And there's various numbers people use on what the average daily use of cows or pigs or whatever in the animal units. But the fact is you're putting a demand on the local water resources that's equivalent to small towns in the countryside. And we know that there's major impacts. In the recent East Norman dairy, it was clear that the amount of water that they needed for 20,000 animal units, 21,000 animal units, was not available in the groundwater. So they hatched a plan to dig a pond and fill it up with the water from the Wild Rice River. Now, fortunately, that project has been deterred. They've withdrawn a lot of it from the pressure from the White Earth tribe trying to protect their land and waters on the White Earth Reservation. But these are known issues and known problems. I live about a half a mile away from a large hog CAFO. They've got 3,000 hogs, about 1,500 animal units there. And they had to drill a 600-foot deep well. It's much deeper than mine, but that's essentially the same as water use as the small town that's 3 miles away. So the quantity is a concern. The water quality, even more so, because what we know with nitrates in particular and pathogens, disease-causing bacteria and viruses that are in manure, that there are sensitive environments in recharge areas where the water infiltration is so rapid that it's in the groundwater within days to weeks. And if you can imagine what that means, that spreading the manure out across the landscape and a heavy rain comes and it's ending up in your well. When I was a consultant years ago, I had a person call me and they said, my water turns muddy after it rains. Should I be concerned? And I said, well, yeah, don't let the dog poo in your yard. You have a direct connection from the surface to your groundwater that you can see in your water quality. And what that means, that whatever is being applied on the surface near you is ending up in your groundwater. Now, fortunately, Minnesota has a good series of geologic maps, geologic sensitivity maps, sensitivity to contamination, soil surveys, etc., that show what the risk to the groundwater is. And that's something that is, in my experience, widely ignored by the feedlot community. That's something that is widely available on the web soil survey, that we can map what the limitations are for manure disposal. And it varies across the state. It's different where I live than in the Red River Valley. But reviewing those maps, the limitations in the Red River Valley around the East Norman feedlot are, number one, shallow groundwater levels. Number two, rapid infiltration. So out in those beach ridge areas, for example, where it's sandy, the water infiltrates immediately into the groundwater. In other areas, the groundwater is right at the surface. So in order to be effective for farming, it would induce drain tillage, where they would install tile at 3 or 4 feet below the surface and try to keep that upper 3 or 4 feet dry so that they can apply row crop, industrial row crop production in those areas. So we know a lot about the risk, we have the knowledge that wells can be affected. Our organization, our common comment for environmental reviews for feedlots is that we want water well testing offered to all of the people within a half a mile of where the wells are being, within a half a mile of the wells that are being used. We've not been successful in getting that adopted as a rule yet. But if we're interested in preserving our public health, we need to take measures like that. We need to test and monitor and assure that we're not creating a pollution problem that we can't recover from. What options do private well owners have to remedy manure or overpumping impacts? Again, with water quality, if there is an overpumping, there's a process that can occur with well interference, and those agricultural producers are responsible to assure your private drinking wells water supply. Now, that's fraught with problems almost every year. The irrigators and big feedlot operators come to the legislature and say, well, we shouldn't have to replace old wells. They've not been successful with that, but the fact is that it is a criteria that an animal feedlot cannot impair your drinking water supply. If the issue is water quality, you have no recourse other than treating your water or drilling a deeper well. I've seen no place in Minnesota where somebody has been able to affirm and claim that a feedlot or farming in general has contaminated the water and that they must reimburse you for those costs. I just read an assessment in Iowa that they expect in the next 5 years, Iowans are going to have to spend $330 million to treat their water from nitrate contamination. It's amazing that we aren't mad as hell about this. Why isn't this a widespread concern? That's something that our organization is trying to make people aware so that we can be forthright and address the inequities caused by people who are polluting our water with a waste disposal method for a commercial purpose and leaving us at risk.
Do you have statistically significant data that provides a picture of what happens to property values in counties or townships with the proliferation of CAFOs? And like any real estate discussion, this question requires an analysis that's based on location. There are so many different variables at work when it comes to the impact on real estate that you really need to look specifically. In my community, we have a combination of lakes, which I believe is very common, obviously, in the northern parts of Minnesota too. But so we have a combination of real estate that's lake homeowners, and then we have a lot of wonderful, fertile farmland, and then we have some real sandy farmland that's not so great. So every community's got a different set of property. The global markets that are trying to come into your area are going to affect those property prices. And what we've seen is that it's basically a downward pressure, particularly on the non-farmland. So when we did our analysis in our town, we looked, 2/3 of our property value was actually not farmland. 1/3 was farmland. So there may be upward pressure on farmland prices, but there will be downward pressure on homes and a lot of the smaller hobby farms or the farms that are not competing in the global market with the real estate. What we've seen specifically is about a 25 to 30% drop in property values. And that's based on people appealing their tax, the assessments on their tax rolls in Greene County, which has had several CAFOs move in Wisconsin. There's also some real good data coming out of the appraisal journal, which if you are interested, you could take a look at that. The other downward pressure that you see is that these big operations only buy maybe 20% of their, make 20% of their purchases locally. And so you lose your small producers that are spending about 95% of their dollars locally. And so that downward pressure pushes on your economy also. And then the other thing that happens is the smaller towns have a lot of trouble recruiting new businesses and new residents because of the smells and the flies and just the overall ambiance of the area. And so you'll have downward pressure on your towns. And we see towns in Iowa that now have these large livestock operations within a half mile of the border of the town, areas that they had zoned to be residential that have now gone to these livestock operations. So that's put a big downward pressure too.
Please explain the tip of the iceberg concept associated with the introduction of CAFOs in a county or township. What are the implications? So as to tip of the iceberg, essentially what happens with the swine industry, imagine a wagon wheel. And so here you are, you've got a wagon wheel, and in the middle you have the hub, right? That's the sow gestational facility. And that sow gestational facility serves as the hub for all of these feeder operations that go out from it. So the babies, of course, are born in that sow gestational facility. Then after a few weeks, and I think it's 4 to 6 weeks, they go to a nursery. That nursery is usually just a couple of miles away. And then they're raised to about 4 months of age, if I recall correctly. And then from there, they go to all these feeder operations. So one sow facility will generate, and that's why I say it's the tip of the iceberg, because it's not just a sow gestational facility, but the goal is that they're going to turn those facilities an average of 2.5 times per year. And then in order to feed all these neighboring operations. And so one facility, if you can, imagine if you've got all these feeder operations, you're going to see, easily 20, 25 different facilities that are going to go up in the immediate area because they're coming from this first gestational facility. What public health issues have you experienced as a result of the presence of CAFOs? These facilities are dangerous. There are dangerous air emissions, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, other gases. I am convinced that my father suffered from hydrogen sulfide poisoning in the fall of 2017. He had to step off the combine that weekend. I was actually there with him. When they're emptying these pits, when they agitate the pits, it causes a tremendous amount of this putrid stench to be emitted. And I'm with my father. He had to step off the combine to vomit. That's how bad it gets. And it's this horrifying stench that I can't even explain. Go to southern Minnesota in the fall of the year, right at the end of fall harvest, because that's when they're spreading the manure. People need to experience this for yourself and drive by these facilities and go by when they're emptying the pits. You need to see it up close. But my brother had registered dogs for many years, and he had to stop because the dogs would vomit around dusk each night, because these are curtain ventilated facilities. They raise the curtains on these facilities to provide for natural ventilation. Well, what does that mean? It means that they're allowing the putrid stench to flow out. Well, it flows out to the neighboring farms, including ours. And so the dogs would start vomiting. That's what happens. Other problems as far as other health issues. I know of several citizens, for example, residents who have had to move, those with asthma, those with other health conditions. You cannot live by one of these facilities. It's not safe. Some people are, frankly, kind of imprisoned in their own homes because they can't go outside. It's not safe. The other problem, of course, is water. And water contamination or well contamination, because when you live in the country, you don't have the benefit of city water and sewage. And so you have your own well. And I know of a few instances where the manure is being spread within feet of private wells, and those wells are contaminated. Usually it's E. coli, with bacteria that gets into the wells. And so here we are, farm families that can't drink their own water. At the Eayrs farm, my husband's family is also from Dodge County. For years, we took bottled water to the Eayrs farm because of the high nitrates in the water. And they had to put in a reverse osmosis system to cleanse the water, and spent several $1,000s so that they could clean the water. So the neighboring pigs are drinking pristine, clear water because they have wells that are dug to 480, 500 feet. And the neighbors have these more, shallower wells that are oftentimes contaminated. Why is this an issue in Becker County? Becker County, I understand, is, and my sense of it, remember, I'm a farm kid from southern Minnesota, but I think of our northern Minnesota lakes country, and I think pristine blue waters. We can all hear the Pabst beer commercial playing in the background. That's what we all think of with northern Minnesota. And that's the livelihood. That's the economic engine that runs northern Minnesota, is the recreation and the lakes. And what's going to happen here is this industry is going to turn northern Minnesota upside down. It's going to pollute your lakes. It's going to pollute the streams. No one knows where this manure is going to be spread. No one's going to tell you. There's very little oversight. You're going to see, we just cannot allow this to happen to our beautiful northern Minnesota lakes country. And this industry does anything and everything they can to skirt the rules. We look, for example, at the water appropriation permits. If you draw more than 1 million gallons of water per year, you're supposed to have a water appropriations permit. In Dodge County, there are 234 registered feedlots. We pulled the data. You know how many water appropriation permits there were? 6. Only 6. And there should have been at least 100 of these operators that had a water appropriations permit. We also went in and audited the manure management plans on file. There should have been about 100 manure management plans on file. You know how many manure management plans were on file? 37. Again, no one knows where and no one knows how much manure is being spread on the land. What is the business model of CAFOs? And I can speak to that in terms of swine CAFOs. Our family farm is surrounded by 12 swine factory farms in a 3-mile radius. 12 in a 3-mile radius. It's overwhelming. We have seen a tremendous change in Dodge County over the past 30 years. And the first one went up in 1993. The second one in the immediate area went up in 1998. The business model, and I know this business model because we've lived it, but I also know the business model because I actually have seen a court transcript that describes the business model. And this is kind of a closely held secret within those who are part of this system. Like, nobody wants to tell you how this all works. And essentially, it's a pyramid scheme. And so imagine a pyramid, and at the top of that pyramid, you have the multinational corporations. And those multinationals are some of the companies that Lisa mentioned, such as Hormel, Tyson, JBS, Smithfield. Those are the companies that control the swine industry. In the middle, we have integrators, and those integrators are companies like Christensen Farms, Holden Farms, Schwartz Farms, and other large integrators, including Iowa Select out of northern Iowa. Those integrators own the sows. Those sows are key to the supply chain. And then the integrators provide the pigs that flow through the system. And they also provide veterinary services and feed. And then at the bottom of that pyramid, you have contract growers. And those contract growers are a series of essentially a number of feeder operations. And I've seen contracts between an integrator and the contract grower. And so I know all the terms of the contract. Then there is also a contract between the integrator and a company such as Hormel. That's referred to as the Hormel matrix. So that's what the business model looks like. It's this pyramid scheme. And then what's the impact on local farmers? Well, I can tell you as a farm family next door to a number of these very large operations. I mean, not only does it impact kind of our day-to-day enjoyment of the property, but it interferes, especially during the fall harvest, which, you know, for any of you who are farmers, fall harvest is go time. Like you've got to be on your game and hurrying to get your crop out before the snow sets in. And what happens is these facilities, the standard facility holds 2,400 hogs. It's just under the limit for environmental review. They have their magic numbers. And there's an 8-foot manure pit underneath an operation, typically that holds 1.1 to 1.3 million gallons of manure. They have to empty those pits in the fall. And in the fall of the year, they have truck after truck after truck. These are semi-tankers that are filled with manure that the semi-tanker then goes out to the field and they apply, I say dump, the manure on the land. And they're supposed to inject that manure. But we know that manure spreading happens at night. Nobody knows where, nobody knows how much manure is going on the land. But imagine you have to empty the pit, and it's even if it's 1 million gallons, and if one semi holds 10,000 gallons of manure, that's 100 trips. And so they're out trying to spread manure. We're out with our combine and our tractor and wagons trying to get our wagons out to the field and come back and forth. Here they are running these semis around and around and around the bend, interfering with our ability to get our crop out in the fall of the year. Not to mention all of the dangerous gases and so forth, because it's dangerous to be out there. How have large corporate CAFOs disrupted the social fabric of rural America? I can speak both to what's happened in my home community and also in terms of what's happened in other rural communities. My family has been on the front lines for well over 20 years fighting corporate factory farms, and it's ugly. These are very divisive fights. They will shatter the community. I can tell you that there are a number of our immediate neighbors, people that I used to babysit when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. Those relationships are broken and there's absolutely no communication. And we have faced tremendous harassment and intimidation, constant garbage in our driveway, in the roadside ditches. I can't tell you how many times I've gone out to pick up garbage along our roadside ditches. Harassing telephone calls to my elderly father when he was still living. Here he is in his late 80s, and he would get telephone calls in the middle of the night. Lowell, have you changed your mind yet? That's pretty intimidating, when you're 85, 86, 87 years old and you get a call like that in the middle of the night. They spread pure Roundup on the corn, one of the cornfields right in the immediate area. We're convinced it was intended for us. It went across the road and it hit the neighbor's yard. It caused thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in damage. Also, inside these facilities, they were blue farm booties, like in a medical facility when you have to gown up and they put booties on. Same thing. So they wear blue farm booties. Well, one day they left blue farm booties. They were soiled, of course, from the neighboring factory farm, and they planted those farm booties about every 100 feet along the township road, leading to our driveway a half mile away. And it was just another message that they were large and in charge. The incident that I talked about where my father sustained hydrogen sulfide poisoning, I took photos that weekend. I'm happy to share them with you. And it shows how they spread manure. But one thing that happened that weekend that a lot of people don't realize, one of the industry insiders contacted the Dodge County Sheriff's Office, not to report some infraction, but to put the heat on me and to try and send a message that, again, that they were large and in charge. And so when the Dodge County Sheriff showed up at our farm just a few minutes after I returned, because I was standing on our Northwest 80 taking photos, he shows up about 15 or 20 minutes later. And I said, what's the issue? He said, well, they said you were blocking the road. And I said, well, I laughed at him and I said, I'd like you to see my photos. He denied, he didn't want to see the photos. And I knew the sheriff's deputy, there's a longer story that goes behind this, but I've seen him in other incidents because they've called the sheriff's department a number of times. And so have we. But I said to the sheriff, they're calling you to get to me and you tell them that it's not working. And so this is a nonsense. I'm telling you, this is how divisive it is in rural America. And don't kid yourself for 1 minute that you're going to be friends with these folks, because it isn't going to happen. And so steel yourselves, be firm and tell them this isn't happening. You're not coming into our community, because they will absolutely ruin your community. And, you know, a simple wave of the hand is now a wave of the middle finger. That's what we get when we go down to southern Minnesota. Another thing that happened, bullet holes shot in the stop sign. My brother and I were out pulling weeds out of the field by the stop sign. The stop sign was maybe 100 feet away. And within a few hours, they peppered it, they sprayed it with bullet holes. So, and we've contacted the sheriff's office. I'm sure I've contacted the sheriff's office at least a dozen times for assistance. So this is the ugliness that isn't talked about, and that's what is occurring in rural America. And stay firm. Don't allow it to happen to your community.
Could you please explain how large corporate CAFOs are really an unsustainable concept? And the first thing that I really want to make clear to folks is the federal and state laws and regulations do not protect our communities from these livestock factories. They were designed for operations that were family-run, small years ago, and this is a huge industrial market that's going to try to come into your area. The Clean Water Act, which is really the only permitting system in place, is really designed to permit pollution, and it only looks at water quality. And most of it is based on nutrient management plans, and those plans were initially designed to maximize production, to maximize corn, soybean production, not to protect water. So the system is very, very weak. You'll get no regulation of the air pollution, massive die-offs. You'll get no regulation of traffic. There's a whole variety of issues that are not covered at all, and that makes it a very unsustainable industry to come into your area. The other problem that we have, I believe it's an issue in many places in Wisconsin, it's a huge issue, is a lack of enforcement depending on who's in office. So we had 8 years of almost no enforcement. You'll see that in many areas. It's difficult for local people to do the enforcement. And if the state's not interested, they won't do it either. So the lack of enforcement of already very weak regulations really makes a problem. The final area that I was going to cover was what are the labor implications for the CAFO business model? And this is a really sensitive area to talk about. but the fact of the matter is that between 70 and 80% of the workers in these large livestock factories, actually in the whole industry, are undocumented workers. And so you have a situation where they don't have the kind of OSHA coverage and the kind of rights that documented workers have. They also don't have the economic impact. They don't spend the money in the economy the way local people do.
Question is, why are some Red River Valley and central sand plain soils found in Becker County problematic? I described with the risk maps, the Web Soil Survey has a section in there about waste management, and there's a map that's titled limitations for manure and food waste, and it describes the soil types that either have high water tables or rapid infiltration or whatever problems. It could be from heavy loads of heavy manure applicators across the landscape. The troubling thing is, around the East Norman area, a 5-mile radius, 90%, more than 90% was severely limited and shouldn't be used for manure application without addressing those specific concerns. So it seems like these proposals move forward and gain a life of their own and try to evade the recognition of the risk or even the tools that we have that would help avoid the risks. Minnesota Department of Agriculture recently developed a tool. It's called the Runoff Risk Assessment Tool, and it's a web-based tool that uses the 1, 3, and 5-day weather forecast and detailed topographic models of your farm, so that you can zoom in and click on a field, and it will tell us what the risk is for runoff in 1, 3, and 5 days. And yet it's not widely adopted. It's not mandated anywhere. We have tools that can help manage those risks, but we aren't adopting them, so it leaves us at risk. How has Winona County approached the CAFO situation, and how are large projects deterred from moving into sensitive areas of the county by the ordinance? Some 20 years ago, Winona County, it was shortly after the generic environmental impact statement for feedlots was published in 2005, I believe. An appendix in that report reported that Winona was among a handful of counties that the animal density already exceeded the land capacity to utilize the manure. We had more animals creating more manure than we had land available to use it as a fertilizer. The county board at that time saw that as a big risk, and they placed a cap on the size of feedlots in Winona County. And the cap is 1,500 animal units. A couple of farms already exceeded that limit, so they were grandfathered in. They're complying or non-complying, but grandfathered in. But no new feedlots over 1,500 animal units are allowed. And even at that, we see fish kills every other year. We see widespread groundwater contamination from those feedlots that are out there. And we have to assess what the issues are. Oftentimes, the smaller operators, those in the 300 to 700 animal unit, don't have appropriate manure storage. So they're forced to spread their manure all year during risky times of the year when the runoff might be excessive or the infiltration is affecting the recharge areas. So we don't have strictly effective means other than that 1,500 animal unit cap. But at the same time, all feedlots aren't immune to those concerns. A hog feedlot across the road from my house, less than a half a mile away, was proposing an expansion up to their 1,500 animal unit cap a number of years ago. And I presented them with the maps. I decided I was just going to call them and say, would you protect our groundwater? And I presented them with the maps of the limitations for manure application overlaid on the maps of the fields where they were going to spread their manure. About a third of the land was not suitable. It had high risk and high limitations due to steep slopes, proximity to streams, drainage ways, wetlands, a variety of factors. A third was not suitable. And to my surprise, the farm said, we can do that. Let us work out the maps. We can program our manure application to avoid those areas. And for 5 years, that is how they've operated their manure application. So they took it at heart. And my discussions with them is they didn't know that we were that concerned about our groundwater. So it takes a village to have safe drinking water, and everybody working on the fact that water is connected to everything. Even their facilities cannot be sustained if they don't have clean drinking water. The question is, how do we protect our communities and assure that that we not have more animal units than the landscape can accommodate, or practices that are not protective of our resources? And the answer comes down to assuring that local ordinances at the township and county level address the sensitive features in your landscape. It's easy to use those soil maps. Identify the areas where there's rapid infiltration and groundwater recharge. Address those areas where large time in the spring, the water levels are so high that you're essentially just mixing the manure in the wetlands. Those are things that consultants can help with. There's more and more web-based surveys available. Actually, there's a very good manual that the Minnesota Department of Agriculture put together, I believe, in 2015, advising local communities on how to make an assessment of sensitive areas and areas that deserve protection. It should be a protection around wells. We should have private wellhead protection. My drinking water, I don't want to have manure spread within 300 feet of my well. We should have those protections around streams and rivers and wetlands, wild rice in your area, the things that are particularly sensitive environments to water quality. So it's a mapping exercise, and then it takes some political will. It takes some will to say water is important for us and all future generations, and we can't afford to impair it now, so we must follow these rules.
What has been your experience with water quality and water usage with a high volume of large feedlots in the area? Our family farm sits at the headwaters of the Cedar River. The Cedar River flows south to Austin, Minnesota, and then into Iowa, and eventually into the Mississippi River. A few years ago, we worked with the Isaac Walton League to collect water samples in the Cedar River. And we collected almost 500 water samples. And believe it or not, 70%, an estimated 70% of those water samples showed the existence of E. coli bacteria exceeding health standards, 70% that exceeded health standards. And they also sent some of those samples to a facility and had them tested for DNA. Well, lo and behold, they showed the presence of swine DNA. No surprise there. As to water usage, I can speak specifically to swine facilities. These are heavy users, heavy water users. A standard facility, you'll recall I mentioned, it's 2,400 hogs, and an average hog uses about 4 gallons of water per day per hog. Well, if you do the math, 2,400 hogs times 4 equals 9,600. And then if I multiply that, you get 90, so that 9,600. So let's say 10,000 gallons of water per day, per facility, times 365 days in a year. That's over 3.5 million gallons of water that's being taken up from the aquifers to support industrial farming. Almost 3.5 million gallons per facility. Now you multiply that times 12 of these facilities in our area, and you have almost 40 million gallons of water that's being taken up for this industry. And a lot of it's being returned contaminated. What have you experienced in your home region now saturated with large corporate CAFOs? Well, I've mentioned that we have 12 swine factory farms in a 3-mile radius. About 20 years ago, there was an effort by the industry to install what would have been the largest dairy CAFO in the state of Minnesota, about 4 or 5 miles north of our farm. That was one of our first experiences fighting the industry. And the industry was, again, this term that I use, large and in charge. They were going to make every effort to try and get that CAFO in place. And it split the neighborhood. But the good news is our farm is on a township road. On the north side of the road is Ripley Township, and on the south side is Westfield Township. Ripley Township at that time adopted local planning and zoning. And you can see the difference in Ripley Township that has local planning and zoning versus Westfield that does not, because in Ripley Township, they have been able, in large part, to keep these industrial factory farms out of the township. Westfield Township is saturated. Has the quality of life increased or decreased with the advent of CAFOs in the immediate area? And I would say that the quality of life has dramatically declined. There has been substantial change in the neighborhood. The swine community comes in, and these CAFOs come in, and think of it as a community within a community. They're reclusive. They do not interact with others in the neighborhood. They have this closed system. The only reason, here we are in the middle of it, and the only reason I know how this system works, because I went to the trouble of getting a court transcript. I went to the Minnesota Supreme Court and Minnesota Court of Appeals over in St. Paul to obtain a copy of that court transcript, and read over 1,000 pages because I wanted to see how this thing works. So imagine you've got like this secret society in your backyard and nobody really knows how it operates. So it's a decline in terms of just the social fabric. Again, this community within a community. It's also the decline in terms of the they're empowered, they feel empowered. It's this arrogance that they've taken on. It's the same arrogance that we see it's this sense of imperialism that we're better than you. And it's just, we're not going to put up with it, and we haven't. So in fact, one of the things that we did, because we weren't going to have it anymore. In addition to contacting the sheriff's department several times for relief, my brother decided that we would put together a mini documentary. So in 2015, he created a mini documentary called The Dark Side of the Other White Meat. And you'll see some of the, we touch on some of the things that we've had to deal with in Dodge County. I tell people that we went to the press not to grab headlines, but for our own safety. Now, isn't that a pathetic statement?
Good question about whether we have a Wisconsin Towns Association, and we do. And the Wisconsin Towns Association has really been most focused on the impact to the roads, because you really need a lot of asphalt and base on your roads in order to have the traffic that these large facilities run. They're not only bringing in grain, like tons and tons of grain, depending on how big they are, but they're all also shipping out animals and obviously shipping out manure. So there's a huge impact on roads. We actually have a pretty big push and pull going on within the Towns Association right now, where the large livestock industry is trying to take over the Towns Association. And it really differs. Each town is different. Each county is different. And so, yeah, that's been a place where there's been a lot of activity. We've also had a lot of activity with the Wisconsin Counties Association, where that when we're working at the county level, they rely on the counties association lawyers to give them legal input. And we got a lot of bad advice from them and had to actually push back on the counties association attorneys and have them change some of their advice to our local county. It's called corporate counsel at the county level. So both the Counties Association and the Towns Association have been places where there's been a lot of activity. We have a question about the efficacy of local ordinances and developing local ordinances. And actually, that is exactly what I've been working on for about all of 2021 and 22. We worked at the county level and were not able to get any kind of protection from county ordinances. So what we did was organize 6 townships together to come together and share, put in the resources to do the legal and the scientific research. And we have developed an ordinance at the township level. 5 of our townships have adopted that ordinance. And it's a very interesting ordinance because it actually requires the permittee to describe how they're going to operate the plant, how they're going to operate their air pollution equipment, how they're going to operate their depopulation if they have a massive die-off, a whole range of issues. And then they set that up, and the town then enforces what they say how they're going to run that plant. And they actually pay for the enforcement and are also required to put up a surety bond or a financial bond so that if they do go out of business, which happens a lot, that there's money in place to clean the site up. So that we've found that at the town level, the township level is the most effective place to work, because there's less political influence. There are fewer people on the board, so you can have an election more easily than at some of the county boards. The question is, how big a geographic area and what area have we organized 6 townships in? And I believe it's 255 square miles, because each township is 36 square miles. Each township is 6 by 6. But we have a couple that go right to the St. Croix River because we're located along the St. Croix River in northern Wisconsin, just on the border with Minnesota. In Wisconsin, the livestock industry totally controls our legislature, and they only need about 17 senators and 50 House members. And so they have control over that legislature, but we have 1,250 townships in Wisconsin. And so that's thousands and thousands of people that they have control. So that's the other reason that local control is really a good strategy to take, because it's much more difficult for them to control that. And actually, we have the Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce and the Wisconsin Farm Bureau are both very concerned about our local ordinances because they view that as something that they can't control. My husband and I are commercial forage producers in Polk County, Wisconsin, and we supply small livestock producers here in our county. There's a vibrant small livestock community of people who are raising cattle in particular, but also sheep and to some extent hogs. And that's the community that we should really be focusing on. Those are the people who spend the money in our area. They're the ones who have kids to fill our schools up. And they're the ones who really care about the local area. So I really recommend that county and town politicians focus on building that part of the ag economy instead of deciding to buy into this global marketplace that's trying to come in.
Why should you as a citizen care about CAFOs? You should, first of all, care about yourself, care about your family, care about your community. Take care of those things, and you've taken care of a lot of good things in your life. It all comes down to care, compassion, and community. And if you care and if you're compassionate about your community, you're going to do a lot in terms of preserving this community for future generations. What can I do about it? I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat. I don't care what your political affiliation is. This is not a political issue. This is about preserving your community. It's about preserving your family legacy. And don't allow this industry to ruin your family legacy the way that they've done so to my family. I won't allow it. I won't allow it to happen to my family, and I won't allow it to happen to your family.
When people contact Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, they have usually just received word or gotten a letter in the mail that a concentrated animal feeding operation or a CAFO is planned for their community, sometimes even just across the fence from the farm that's been in their family for generations. And they're in crisis mode. They're looking for help, for someone to come alongside them who has experienced this before and understands what they're up against. And SRAP provides that support, listening and strategizing with community members based on their goals and their concerns, and helping them navigate the complex, corrupted permitting system, also while educating their fellow community members about the threat of this industrial livestock model. And these CAFOs confine thousands or even hundreds of thousands of animals without access to pasture. They're designed to basically maximize profits by raising as many animals as possible, as quickly as possible, on as little land as possible. And that concentration produces millions of gallons of waste that is stored for months at a time in pits and then spread on surrounding farm fields or exported elsewhere with little to no oversight. This model has far-reaching effects on rural communities and public health and our environment. And as difficult as it may seem to stand up and speak out that this is not the future of agriculture you want for your community, you can push back. There are ways to hold these corporations accountable and to hold regulators accountable to protect the environment. Sometimes sheer public outcry is enough to discourage an incoming CAFO. Other times, communities have to persevere through every public process or even legal challenge available to them. We've worked with communities who rally people together at the local level to convince their county commissioners that a project is not a good fit for their community. And occasionally those elected officials will stand by them and deny a project or at least require specific conditions to attempt to reduce those negative impacts. Other communities have taken their concerns all the way to the state level, advocating for rules and legislation that would provide more protections and accountability, as well as increased transparency so that the public can actually have access to information about the waste these facilities are generating, what violations they have, and what enforcement the agency is implementing to correct it. Information about what's happening in their watersheds around this facility. So if you or someone you know is facing an industrial livestock operation, you can contact SRAP for help. We have a help hotline, or you can contact us through our website. But we want you to know that you're not alone. There are others all across the country facing the same thing, and we are coming together to correct this system that has allowed corporations to control our food system. But it's going to take all of us, and it's going to be a long uphill battle convincing those in power that there's an alternative to this industrial model. But we see a future where that's possible, where farmers and rural communities can thrive, and where we truly treasure the land and the water that sustains us so that it's preserved for future generations.